A federal courtroom. Silence. Then, Justice William Alsup leans back, lips curling into a grin that carries more than amusement. It is the grin of a man convinced of his own supremacy, the grin of someone who has seen challengers come and go, all crumbling under the weight of his authority. The spectators shift in their seats, sensing the imbalance of power already tilting toward the bench. For a moment, it feels like the ending has been written before the fight has even begun. Across the room sits Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She does not flinch. Her eyes lock on the judge with an intensity that betrays no fear. To some, she may appear outmatched. A younger black woman, outspoken, fiery, daring to face down a figure cloaked in decades of institutional prestige. To others, she is precisely the storm they have been waiting for, an embodiment of resilience, carrying not just her own story, but the weight of millions who know what it feels like to be dismissed, laughed at, or underestimated. Alsup's grin lingers as he interrupts her opening argument. His tone casual, almost mocking. He believes that a condescending smirk can erase the force of her words. He believes this exchange will end the way it always has, with his gavel, his authority, his narrative cemented in stone. But the energy in the chamber is shifting. Viewers can feel it. Crockett sits straighter, her silence stretching longer than expected, commanding attention without uttering a single word. The pause unsettles the room. The grin on Alsup's face grows wider, but beneath it a flicker of unease stirs. Those watching sense it. He may have underestimated her resolve. Crockett is not here to play by the old rules, not here to be patronized into silence. Every heartbeat carries the suspense of an unspoken promise that when she does speak, it will not just be a rebuttal, it will be a reckoning. The tension is unbearable now. The audience leans forward. Phones in pockets buzz as if aware that history is about to demand their screens. And then, Jasmine Crockett opens her mouth ready to deliver the words that will flip the power dynamic in an instant. What was really at stake in that courtroom was not a single argument or a narrow point of law. It was something larger, something heavier, the kind of weight that presses on every person who has ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to know their place. Justice Alsup may have thought this was another ordinary proceeding, another moment where his grin and his robe carried the day. But for Jasmine Crockett, and for those who watched her, this was about more than a clash of legal minds. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about the silenced finally refusing to be silenced again. Outside the courtroom, the country was already fraying at its edges. Debates raged on cable news, on Twitter, on living room screens across America. People felt the division between those who held power and those who demanded to be heard. For some, this courtroom scene was just another skirmish. For others, it was a battlefield where years of frustration and invisibility finally found a voice. And that voice belonged to Jasmine Crockett. Every movement, every glance was charged with symbolic meaning. When Alsup grinned, he wasn't just grinning at her. He was grinning at every community that has fought to be taken seriously. When he interrupted, it wasn't just Crockett he cut off. It was the echo of countless voices dismissed before they could finish their sentence. The stakes stretched far beyond the wooden benches of that chamber. They stretched into neighborhoods where young people wondered if their voices mattered. They stretched into immigrant households where silence had been taught as a form of survival. They stretched into the hearts of millions who needed to see that arrogance could be challenged and dignity defended. The media cameras were rolling, but so was something less visible and far more powerful, the collective attention of a nation hungry for a moment that meant something. America has always had its showdowns, moments when truth and arrogance collide, when power and resistance meet eye to eye. This was one of those moments. It was about whether a smirk could still shut down truth, or whether truth had finally found a champion unwilling to bow. As Crockett sat there, steady and unflinching, she carried more than her own argument. She carried the hopes of those who had been laughed at in classrooms, talked over in boardrooms, disregarded in courtrooms. The stakes were not written in the legal briefs. They were written in the lived experiences of millions who saw themselves in her defiance. And so, the silence stretched, the tension grew, and the nation held its breath. Viewers watching online would later say they felt their hearts pounding even through the screen, as if the outcome of their own struggles depended on what Crockett would do next, because in many ways it did. and yet no one in the room could predict how Crockett would respond. To understand the weight of that grin, you have to understand the man behind it. Justice William Alsup had built his career on authority, intellect, and a reputation that blended sharpness with an almost theatrical impatience for those who dared to cross him. In the legal world, he was seen as a figure who prided himself on cutting through arguments with precision, sometimes with brilliance, but often with a smugness that left challengers humiliated. He was not the kind of judge who merely listened. He was the kind who performed, who signaled his dominance with every glance, every pause, every carefully timed smirk. In his courtroom, silence could be as sharp as a blade. Lawyers who stepped into his presence learned quickly that one raised eyebrow, one amused grin, could send their confidence crashing. He had the gift or the curse of projecting absolute certainty, of making others feel small in the shadow of his authority. And for years that reputation had served him well. Cases were decided, reputations crushed, and opponents walked away not just defeated but diminished. The grin was his calling card. It was not the grin of warmth or humor. It was the grin of dismissal, the grin of a man who had seen countless arguments collapse under his gaze. When William Alsup grinned, it meant he believed he had already won. And in most cases he had. Those who challenged him found themselves unraveling, second-guessing their words, faltering under the weight of that carefully cultivated aura. But beneath the surface of that polished exterior, contradictions lurked. He projected the image of the impartial jurist, but too often his tone betrayed a man who relished control, who fed on the imbalance between himself and those who stood before him. He was articulate, educated, respected in elite circles, yet his arrogance made him blind to the deeper realities outside his marble halls. He could quote precedent with elegance, but he struggled to see dignity in those he deemed beneath him. His supporters praised his intellect. His critics whispered of a man who had mistaken authority for infallibility. And this contradiction was his weakness. For all his learning, for all his authority, William Alsup believed the myth of his own untouchability. He had convinced himself that no one could challenge him, that his grin was enough to silence not just arguments but entire people. Over time, that confidence calcified into arrogance, an arrogance so deep it blinded him to the possibility that someone might not just withstand his presence, but dismantle it. So when he leaned back in his chair that day, watching Jasmine Crockett with that all-too-familiar smile, he believed he was replaying a scene he had lived 100 times before. In his mind, this was another eager voice about to stumble, another idealist about to collapse under the pressure of his authority. The grin told the room, "I've already seen how this ends. You don't stand a chance." But what Alsup didn't know was that he was no longer operating in the shadows of quiet courtrooms or insulated halls. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And across the country, people were no longer content to see another powerful man smirk his way past accountability. He didn't just underestimate Jasmine Crockett. He underestimated the moment, the hunger of millions for a figure who would not break under arrogance. The grin, the very weapon that had served him for decades, would soon become his undoing. What he thought was a symbol of dominance would become the image of his defeat. And as the silence stretched in that courtroom, as Crockett prepared her reply, the mask of invincibility that Alsup had worn for so long was already beginning to crack, because this time, that grin would backfire. Jasmine Crockett's presence in that courtroom was not an accident of circumstance. It was the result of years of battles, many fought in public but just as many waged in the quiet corners of life where grit and resilience are forged. To see her sitting there unflinching in the face of a grinning judge was to see the culmination of a journey that defied the odds, a journey that gave her the fire to resist when others would have bowed their heads. Her story begins far from marble chambers and elite institutions. Crockett grew up in a world where respect was never freely given. It had to be earned, demanded, fought for at every turn. She carried the lessons of family and community, lessons about standing tall when others wanted you small, lessons about finding your voice when the world told you to stay silent. From the start, she was taught that silence was not safety, that silence was surrender. Law became her chosen weapon, not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. She studied the system not as an abstract puzzle, but as a battlefield where the lives of real people were at stake. Her early career was not cushioned by privilege. She didn't begin in comfortable offices lined with leather-bound books. She began in crowded courtrooms, defending those who had no one else to defend them. She carried files through long nights, showed up to hearings with exhaustion in her bones, and still refused to quit. Each case was a story, each client a reminder that justice was too often rationed by wealth and status. There were setbacks, many of them. Doors closed in her face, colleagues underestimated her, and institutions questioned her right to be there. The labels came fast, too young, too loud, too unpolished. But Crockett knew that those labels were not mistakes. They were weapons meant to diminish her. Instead of shrinking, she sharpened herself against them. Every slight became fuel, every dismissal another reason to double down on her mission. She learned composure in the moments when anger might have burned her credibility. She learned fire in the moments when composure alone would not be enough. She became the rare figure who could balance both, the calm of a lawyer who knew her case and the passion of an advocate who carried the pain of those silenced too long. That duality was her strength, and as her career advanced, her role expanded beyond individual clients. She stepped into politics not because she sought titles, but because she sought change. Representing her district meant carrying the voices of people who had been ignored by the system for far too long. It meant walking into halls of power where her very presence was a disruption. Each debate, each floor speech, each headline was another reminder that she would not be dismissed. The cost of this path was heavy. Public scrutiny was relentless. Critics circled with sharpened knives, and the weight of expectation sometimes felt unbearable. Yet Crockett endured. She endured because she knew that her struggles were not hers alone. She carried the weight of history, the battles of those who had come before her, and the hope of those who would come after. So when she sat in that federal courtroom, facing the smirk of Justice Alsup, she carried more than her own argument. She carried the memory of every time she had been interrupted, underestimated, or written off. She carried the strength of the countless nights when exhaustion threatened to break her, but resolve carried her through. She carried the voices of her community, the struggles of her clients, and the relentless push to prove that dignity would not be silenced. Her journey made her more than a politician, more than a lawyer. It made her a symbol of resistance forged in struggle, and in that moment she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because fate handed it to her, but because she had fought for it every step of the way. As Alsup leaned back with that grin, he saw only a woman to be dismissed. What he could not see was the battlefield she had already survived, the countless attempts to silence her that had only made her voice louder. What he could not see was that she was not just answering for herself, she was answering for everyone who had been told their words didn't matter, and those very battles prepared her for this moment when the stakes were higher than ever. The air in the courtroom was tense, charged like a storm waiting to break. Crockett had just begun to lay out her argument, her words steady and deliberate, when Alsup leaned forward with that familiar air of impatience. "Counselor," he cut in, his tone smooth but edged with condescension, "you've wandered too far from the matter at hand." His grin widened, a grin that told the room he was enjoying this interruption far more than the substance of the case. For a moment, Crockett paused. She glanced at her notes, then back at him, not with the look of someone rattled, but with the calm stare of someone who had endured this pattern too many times before. She resumed her argument, her voice unwavering, her cadence deliberate. Again he interrupted. "You're missing the precedent," he said, waving a hand dismissively as if brushing away a child's mistake. A ripple went through the courtroom. Spectators recognized the tactic: undermine, dismiss, belittle. His grin stayed fixed, as though the entire proceeding was little more than a stage for his performance. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned into the silence he created, letting the pause stretch until it was no longer his interruption that dominated the room, but her composure. When she spoke again, her tone carried a new weight, each word landing with precision. "Your Honor, with all respect, what I am laying out is not a distraction from the matter. It is the matter. It goes to the very heart of why this case stands here today." Her calmness made the grin twitch ever so slightly. Still, Alsup persisted. "I've heard this before," he said, leaning back as though bored, his smile curling wider. "You're dressing up rhetoric as law." That was the spark. Crockett's eyes sharpened, and her voice, though still controlled, carried a fire that commanded the room. "With due respect, Your Honor, rhetoric is what the powerful use to dismiss truth. What I present is not rhetoric. It is lived reality backed by law, and no amount of grinning will erase it. Gasps moved through the gallery. The balance of the room shifted. For the first time, Alsup seemed unsettled, his posture stiffening, the confidence of his interruptions faltering under the force of her words. He attempted to interject again, but Crockett pressed forward, her timing impeccable. I came here prepared for questions. I came here prepared for scrutiny. What I will not accept is being treated as though my argument is beneath consideration. That kind of dismissal has been used against voices like mine for far too long. And if this courtroom is to mean anything, if justice is to mean anything, then it begins with respect. The room was silent now. Even the faint shuffle of papers had ceased. All eyes moved between the judge and the congresswoman, watching as the dynamic flipped. As the authority of the robe clashed with the authority of truth, Alsup tried to grin again, to summon the old gesture that had silenced so many before. But it no longer carried the same weight. Something in the air had shifted. Something in his certainty had cracked. The grin looked thinner now, less a weapon than a shield. And then, the grin vanished. The silence that followed was electric. It wasn't the silence of boredom or procedure. It was the silence that comes before a lightning strike. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on Jasmine Crockett, waiting, almost daring her to press forward. Even the stenographer, who had typed through countless hearings without glancing up, had her fingers poised in midair. Crockett inhaled slowly. Steadying her breath, her gaze locked on the man behind the bench. She began softly, almost conversationally, her tone so measured it forced everyone to lean in. Your Honor, you call my argument rhetoric, but let me remind you, every precedent we stand on today began as rhetoric. Every piece of jurisprudence that built this system was once just words spoken aloud. The Constitution itself was rhetoric before it was ratified, words on parchment before they became law. The law is not born in silence, it is born when someone dares to speak. She paused, letting the words hang in the charged air. Heads in the gallery turned, some nodding subtly. Crockett continued, her voice sharpening. So when you dismiss what I say as rhetoric, you dismiss the very foundation of your own authority. And if your grin suggests that truth has no place here, then I must ask, what is this courtroom for? A murmur rippled through the spectators. Alsup shifted in his chair. His smirk, once confident and unshakable, began to falter. He reached for his gavel but hesitated, sensing that to cut her off now would only confirm her point. Crockett pressed on. You see, I've lived on the other side of that grin. I've lived in communities where people don't have the luxury of being heard, where judges and lawmakers wave away their pleas with the flick of a hand or a dismissive smile. I've sat with families who believed the system wasn't built for them, because every time they spoke they were interrupted. Every time they fought they were told to wait their turn. But justice doesn't come to those who wait. It comes to those who demand it. Her voice rose, not in anger but in conviction. Each sentence carried the cadence of someone who knew the rhythm of both law and lived experience. And I stand here today not to be indulged, not to be tolerated, but to be heard, because my clients, my constituents, and yes, this country, deserve more than a grin from power when truth is spoken. The courtroom was still. Even Alsup's clerks exchanged glances as if unsure how to react. One adjusted his glasses nervously. Another scribbled furiously on a notepad, though her hand trembled slightly. Alsup tried to interject, his tone strained. Counselor, you are dangerously close to... But Crockett cut in, her timing perfect, her voice slicing through his words like a blade. Close to what, Your Honor? Close to honesty? Close to exposing the truth that arrogance does not equal authority? If so, then yes, I am very close, gasps erupted from the gallery. A spectator in the back stifled an exclamation. Even the journalists scribbling notes could hardly keep up, their pens scratching faster as if they knew they were recording a moment that would replay across the country. Crockett's voice softened again, a deliberate shift that magnified its power. I was taught that justice requires courage. Courage to listen, courage to challenge, courage to face uncomfortable truths. And I will not apologize for bringing that courage into this courtroom, because justice without courage is nothing more than ceremony, and ceremony will not save the people who depend on us. Her words landed like thunder. Even those who came in skeptical felt themselves leaning toward her, drawn into the gravity of her conviction. Crockett wasn't just arguing a case anymore. She was delivering a truth that transcended the courtroom. Alsup's grin had now fully disappeared. His jaw tightened. He fidgeted with the papers before him, flipping them unnecessarily as if the shuffling could mask the loss of control. The man who once commanded the room with ease now looked diminished, a shadow of the authority he projected. Crockett, sensing the shift, leaned in slightly, her voice steady as steel. Respect is not optional in this chamber. It is the foundation of justice. And when I see it denied, when I hear it mocked, I will not stand silent. Because silence is complicity, and I will never be complicit in the dismissal of truth. The spectators erupted, not in loud applause, but in whispered affirmations, nods, and the kind of emotional energy that no gavel could contain. Even in restraint, the room vibrated with agreement. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Crockett's words hung in the air, her presence radiating a quiet authority that eclipsed the bench itself. Alsup stared back at her, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He had been bested not by theatrics, but by unshakable conviction. And then she delivered the final strike, her words deliberate and unflinching. So grin if you must, Your Honor. But know this, your grin will never silence me. It will never silence the people I represent, and it will not silence the truth. The chamber fell into a heavy silence thicker than before. Every person knew they had just witnessed something rare. The moment when dignity crushed arrogance, when truth bent power to its knees. Alsup sat motionless, his authority intact on paper but shattered in spirit. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His once familiar grin was gone, replaced by the strained stillness of a man unaccustomed to being challenged and losing. Jasmine Crockett had done more than argue. She had turned the courtroom into a stage for truth and the audience into witnesses of a reckoning. But the shockwaves didn't end in that courtroom. The courtroom exchange might have ended with the gavel's fall, but the true impact began the moment the footage hit the outside world. Within minutes, a grainy clip taken from a reporter's phone was uploaded to social media. By the time it finished buffering, the comment section was already exploding. Twitter, or what remained of it in this age of hyper-accelerated discourse, lit up with fire. The first viral hashtag appeared almost instantly. Grin shutdown. Then another. Crockett McDrop. And by dawn, both had surged into the top global trends. One tweet, simple but powerful, amassed hundreds of thousands of retweets within hours. Justice isn't a grin. Justice is courage. Tonight, Jasmine Crockett reminded us all of that. Crockett McDrop memes flooded in like a tidal wave. Someone looped Alsup's smug grin fading into a scowl, setting it to dramatic orchestral music. Another slowed down Crockett's final line, "Your grin will never silence me," overlaying it with storm clouds parting to reveal sunlight. TikTok creators stitched themselves cheering, crying, or mock grinning into the clip. Even teenagers who had never stepped foot in a courtroom were duetting the moment, as if it were the climax of a superhero film. On Instagram, carousel posts circulated with bold captions, "The day arrogance lost," "Dignity," "Smugness," "Respect is non-negotiable." Cable news producers seized the moment like oxygen. Within 24 hours, Crockett's exchange dominated primetime lineups. Liberal commentators hailed her as a force of truth in a chamber starved for it. Conservative outlets tried to frame it as disrespect in the courtroom. But even among critics, there was a grudging acknowledgement. Alsup had been rattled. One anchor opened her nightly broadcast with the words, "Tonight, a young congresswoman faced down one of the nation's most seasoned judges and won the room." The footage played again, this time in slow motion with dramatic pauses as Crockett delivered her counterattack. It wasn't just coverage, it was canonization. Podcasts rushed to dissect the moment. One legal analyst called it a masterclass in rhetoric under pressure. Another compared it to watching David aim the stone. Only this time the whole world was live streaming the slingshot. Even celebrities weighed in. A-list actors tweeted praise. Musicians quoted her final line during concerts. And one late-night comedian dedicated an entire sketch to reenacting Alsup's grin, fading as a laugh track roared. Meanwhile, Alsup himself became the internet's newest villain. His name trended, not for his decades on the bench, but for one expression that had backfired spectacularly. Political cartoonists exaggerated his grin into a caricature of arrogance, while commentators framed him as the embodiment of institutional condescension. For the first time in his career, his authority wasn't untouchable, it was meme fodder. But the real story wasn't the ridicule, it was the rallying. Across the country, Crockett's supporters gathered digitally, their admiration crystallizing into a movement. Hashtags evolved into calls for action. Respect isn't optional became a rallying cry printed on t-shirts, posters, and profile banners. A viral fundraiser launched overnight to support legal aid groups in underserved communities, surpassing its goal in less than 12 hours, all in Crockett's name. Comment threads buzzed with declarations. She spoke for all of us who've been talked over. Finally, someone who doesn't flinch when power tries to laugh them off. This isn't about one courtroom. This is about every room where voices are silenced. The momentum felt unstoppable. In bars, offices, and classrooms, people replayed the video, quoting Crockett's words as if they were scripture. For a moment, America found itself united, not around a policy, but around a principle. And in that unity, a new narrative crystallized. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a participant in the system. She was a champion chosen by the people. She had stepped into the lion's den, faced down the roar of arrogance, and emerged with something no verdict could grant: legitimacy in the eyes of millions. Alsup's grin, once a symbol of untouchable authority, had been transformed into the face of defeat. Crockett's calm, her fire, her unflinching dignity. These became the story. And so the legend spread. The day the courtroom trembled, the day arrogance cracked, the day Jasmine Crockett turned silence into thunder. The people had chosen their champion. When the noise of the internet frenzy began to settle, when the commentators moved from hot takes to deeper reflections, one truth cut through like a beam of light. What Jasmine Crockett had done in that courtroom was bigger than a legal clash. It was a parable about dignity, about what happens when ordinary people dare to stand unflinching in front of power that assumes it cannot be challenged. In the days that followed, Crockett herself leaned into that message. She didn't gloat. She didn't turn the moment into a personal victory lap. Instead, she reframed it as something larger, something universal. "This was never just about me," she said at a community gathering, her voice steady, her presence commanding. This was about what it means to refuse silence. It was about every worker who's been laughed at in a boardroom, every student who's been mocked in a classroom, every immigrant who's been dismissed as less than. That grin wasn't mine alone to confront. It belonged to all of us. The room erupted in applause, but more importantly, hearts stirred. People felt seen. Crockett wasn't casting herself as a lone warrior. She was holding up a mirror to her audience, telling them the courage had always been theirs, waiting for a moment to be called out. That is why the footage replayed again and again, not simply because it was entertaining or dramatic, but because it touched something deeply human. Everyone at some point in their lives had faced an Alsup, someone who smirked when they spoke, someone who used condescension as a weapon, someone who believed status equaled superiority. And for everyone who had walked away wishing they'd had the perfect words, Crockett became a vessel of redemption. She spoke when they could not. She stood when they had been pushed down. In this way, her reply became more than an argument. It became a moral lesson etched into memory. Arrogance has no lasting power against truth spoken with dignity, and there was something profoundly American in that. The story resonated with the same notes that echo through the nation's founding ideals, the belief that titles and power are not the final word, that courage belongs to the many, not the few. Crockett embodied that creed in a way that felt raw, fresh, and urgently necessary. Even critics, when pressed, could not fully dismiss the impact. They might quibble about tone or tradition, but the honesty of the exchange was undeniable. She had not bowed, and in not bowing, she reminded millions that respect is not granted by the powerful. It is claimed by the dignified. The beauty of her stand was not in the sting of her words, but in the calm with which she delivered them. No shouting, no theatrics, just the steady conviction of someone who had endured too much in life to ever be shaken by a grin. That composure became her signature, and the lesson it carried was unmistakable. True strength is measured not in volume, but in presence. And so the arc of the courtroom story closed not with Alsup's gavel, but with Crockett's resolve. She left that chamber not just as a congresswoman or an advocate, but as a symbol, a reminder, a living testament that the small and the silenced can rise, that arrogance will always crack when confronted by dignity. What lingered was not the grin of a judge, but the voice of a woman who refused to be diminished. But even as her words echoed across the nation, another question began to form, a question that would determine whether this moment was a spark or the start of something far greater. Because what happened inside that courtroom was only the beginning. Justice William Alsup grinned that day, certain his authority was untouchable, but Jasmine Crockett shut him down, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with unshakable dignity. What began as a smug smirk ended as a lesson for the nation. Arrogance can never silence truth. This wasn't just a courtroom exchange. It was a reminder that power is not in the titles people carry or the robes they wear. It's in the courage to speak when others would be silenced. Crockett showed that respect is not something granted at the pleasure of the powerful. It is a birthright, claimed by those who refuse to bow their heads, and that is why this moment has echoed far beyond those marble walls. It belongs to every person who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or laughed at for daring to stand tall. It belongs to anyone who knows what it means to be underestimated and what it feels like to prove them wrong. So let this story stay with you. Let it remind you that no grin, no smirk, no gesture of condescension is stronger than the calm conviction of someone who knows their worth. If you believe arrogance should never triumph over truth, share this moment. Spread it. Let others feel the power of dignity rising above dismissal. And if you want more stories where justice and courage prevail, where the underestimated claim their rightful place, join us here, subscribe. Be part of this movement. Because the fight for respect, for dignity, for justice, it isn't over. It's just beginning. And voices like Jasmine Crockett's will need all of us to keep that truth alive. The grin faded. The silence broke. And dignity won.